Perhaps nothing speaks to the decline of the Republican Party as much as this, what amounts to a presidential portrait of the disgraced ex-president and almost certainly the GOP nominee for president in the year 2024, who faces 91 felony counts across 4 indictments, 91 more felony counts and 4 more indictments than any other U.S. president or presidential candidate combined. It is a far cry from monuments and memorials and tributes throughout U.S. history, honoring presidents of both parties who honored the office and its responsibilities and its prestige, its stature. Friend of the show, Charlie Sykes, writes this in the Bulwark today, quote, "If you elect a serial liar and con man, a narcissist, a bully, a wannabe mobster, with the vocabulary of an emotionally insecure 9-year-old, you can't really be shocked at how it turned out, can you? This is what Trump wanted, because this is what he chose. It was also the GOP's choice, time and again. Republicans had a chance to draw the line, or at least take an off-ramp. They could have stood astride all the insanity and criminality and said no. They could have impeached and disqualified him forever." Let's bring in the editor-at-large for The Bulwark and MSNBC contributor, Charlie Sykes. John Heilemann is back here. Charlie, I think maybe you have to have been in the Republican Party or aligned with it to see how clearly that Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell bear as much responsibility as Donald Trump does for where we are. When in the days after the election was over and it was abundantly clear that everyone else who was on those 2020 ballots was heading back to Washington, every Republican member of Congress, my election was fine, I'm heading back. They knew there was no fraud, and their decision to let Trump cry it out, which he didn't really do, he actually plotted an insurrection against his own country, was as instrumental as anything else in bringing us to this moment. Your piece captures that.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of step by step, brought us to this moment. For those of us that have watched Donald Trump over the years, it is not shocking that his character and his conduct would lead to this moment. But it wouldn't have been possible if the Republican Party had not gone along with all of this. So you had a lot of cowardice after January 6th, but also a lot of magical thinking. And I think, it's worth stepping back and realizing that the shock of a Republican Party still embracing a president under indictment, this is not just an MSNBC thing or a Bulwark thing. This shock is a Republican thing, because a lot of the magical thinking was, well, surely we don't have to do anything about it because these indictments will take him out. There's no way that he will be able to be perp walked and then be a viable candidate. That was the premise behind Mitch McConnell's refusal to vote to remove him, right? Because he thought the criminal justice system would take care of him, so he didn't have to spend any political capital. But this is how shocking it is, Nicole. This was also the premise behind people like Ron DeSantis, who I think were assuming I don't need to take any shots at Donald Trump because, look, what's going to happen is he's going to be indicted, people are going to turn away from him, and I'm going to be the last man standing. So here we are in the end of August, 2023, and the party of law and order is still rallying around someone whose mugshot is on the front page of every newspaper in America. I mean, I don't think we should downplay how truly extraordinary that is.
Well, and John Heilemann, the idea, the what of the mugshot, I think is less horrifying than what he would do as the mugshot president. I mean, he's running on an agenda of dismantling the FBI. And if anyone thinks he'd leave the CIA and the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense intact, then they are the ones engaged in magical thinking. I mean, the mugshot president plans on being a second-term destroyer of the rule of law and the institutions he didn't quite finish off.
I mean, Nicole, in the last block, we talked about the Doug Brinkley thing about the Jesse James presidency, the Jesse James candidacy. Jesse James doesn't have any interest in seeing a strong FBI. Jesse James doesn't have any interest in having a strong Justice Department. Just imagine John Dillinger as your next president, John Gotti as your next president. Like, those guys do the same thing. They would dismantle the Department of Justice and the FBI too. I think that I say that in a way sort of to bid for a laugh, but I also mean it in a serious way. Charlie does this thing. And I know Charlie is one of the good ones, right? And he's one of the good guys. He understands what's happened to his former party, or the party that was once his party and that he once embraced. But he says the party of law and order, The Republican Party is no longer the party of law and order. The party of that was once the party of law and order. The party that was what it used to be the party of low deficits, of muscular foreign policy and alliances abroad. Yeah. None of the things that were what the Republican Party are is what the Republican Party is now. They are now the party of Jesse James, John Gotti, of celebrity criminals. That's what they are. That's what the party is. And to call it the party of law and order is, and I know Charlie knows this, and I'm not giving him a hard time. Right. I'm just saying the people do it by reflex. It's a nostalgic, it's nostalgic, vestigial thinking of what the party once was. It's not that anymore. It is this other thing.
Absolutely not.
Go ahead, Charlie.
No, I mean, he's absolutely not. I mean, I should have said the party that was formerly known as the party of law and order, just like the Republican Party being formerly known for fiscal conservatism, or formerly caring about things like character or strong muscular foreign policy. I mean, you can run down the list of all of the things that have been abandoned in terms of policy. And you just see that the fact that, I mean, we've talked about how it's become a cult of personality, but I think that even Republicans underestimated the degree to which that cult of personality would take them down this road. I mean, this moment where you have, 6 of the 8 candidates for president raising their hand, saying that they would still vote for a man who had been charged, tried, and found guilty by a jury of his peers of felonies. I mean, 5 minutes ago, John, this would have been the easiest question in the world, right? Of course, you're not going to support a convicted felon. But here we are, tens of millions of Republicans are willing to go along with this. So if the Republican Party was once legitimately the party of law and order, that's long, long, long gone.
It is sort of like I find myself saying these things and then knowing instantly that they're not true, but it's so fast, right? I mean, Romney and McCain ran on a platform of Russia being America's, largest geopolitical ally. And on the debate stage, I think only 2 people stood up for continuing the current pace of aid for Ukraine. Howman, the other piece of this, though, this sort of being John Gotti, is the way the window has sort of shifted, and that no one really, I think we led with it one day, but, the platform of the DeSantis candidacy, which I know is ill-fated, but it is also to dismantle the FBI, to move it out of, destroying the rule of law is what happened to the one-time party that pretended to care about law and order. They're now for not just for going against it, not just for celebrating brutal attacks described as medieval combat by the law enforcement officials engaged in it with Trump's own supporters. The candidates for president on the Republican side want to dismantle the federal agency charged with dealing with drug cartels, with preventing terrorism, with dealing with domestic terrorism. I mean, that's their stated position, not hidden.
Right. Well, and Nicole, I say, with some degree of this will sound like I'm complimenting them. I'm not complimenting them when I say this, but they are for these things because those are the things that the Republican Party is for. The categorical mistake that we make over and over again is that these people who are running for office are the Republican Party. They're not. The people who are office holders of the Republican Party are the Republican Party. They're not. They are the representatives of the Republican Party, and they have a feel for what the base of the Republican Party, the majority of their party wants. That majority is the majority that has the majority of the party, not of the country, but of the party that has supported Donald Trump because they agree with him. They want the Dillinger president. They want the Gotti president. They want the Jesse James president. They hate the FBI. They hate the Department of Justice. They think it's all the deep state. And Ron DeSantis and the rest of these people are being responsive to what they believed correctly is what the actual party actually wants. If the party didn't want those things, they would believe something else because they have no real convictions on any of these issues. They see the way the party reacts to what's happening to Trump. They read the polls accurately. They are in touch with what the Republican Party has become, and they're scrambling not to lead it, but to follow it and to not be left behind by it. And that's why they're in this position. I have no idea what Ron DeSantis actually thinks about the Department of Justice or the FBI or any of these issues. I know he knows he can't get nominated if he's not on the same side as Donald Trump on those issues, and that's why he says what he says.